Oh hey, it's Wes. Pumpkin spice muffins. What a time to be alive. Oh, and it's time to talk about part 2 of my iPhone camera review, photo quality. If you missed part 1, which you probably did, because upon releasing it, my entire channel got delisted, and it didn't really go out to anyone because I assume someone filed a takedown complaint on my video for it being inappropriate. If you want to judge for yourself, just click up here, watch that first, get caught up on what I think about the video quality of the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro. Although I am a professional photographer, how I see the iPhones is not as necessarily a professional tool. Yes, I got the iPhone 11 Pro, that's for other reasons. I see it as a way of me not having to put in even more work to editing photos and spending time on photography. I already have a backlog of thousands of images that I need to edit, that I need to push out to clients. I spend a lot of time editing and going through images. But having pictures of everyday life is also very important to me. And that's where this comes in. It's the phone that you have with you, and if it can take great pictures without you having to dive in and massage the pictures, as you generally do with a real camera for especially difficult situations, that's fantastic. So let's look at how this does, not as a professional, but through everyday life, snapping it, default camera app, trying to get the best results possible with minimal effort. That's what smartphone cameras are all about. So let's do it. So what have we got? Basic specs. 3 cameras on the back, 1 camera on the front. 3 on the back, we have a 13mm equivalent f2.4 aperture, super wide lens. We have a 26mm equivalent f1.8 aperture, wide lens, and a 52mm f2.0 aperture, standard lens. They call it their tele lens, but that's actually a standard focal length. That's not a lot of reach in the grand scheme of things. Then, selfie camera, we've got a 23mm, pretty wide angle lens, f2.2 aperture. So how does that compare to the previous generation? Well, if you don't know what an aperture is, that's how wide the actual lens opening is. It's a difficult thing to create a wider aperture in a smaller space, and obviously we have a small space. Wider your aperture, the more light you have, the higher quality your picture can be when you don't have all the light in the world. You're not staring directly into the sun. So the old one, we have the same sensor sizes, which is a 1/2.55 inch sensor for the main and a 1/3.4 inch sensor for the tele. But the biggest difference in the hardware itself is on the longer reach lens, the standard lens, we have an f2.0 aperture, whereas on the old one there's an f2.4. That's almost 50% more light being gathered. That's a fantastic upgrade. And on the selfie cam, we've gone from a 7 megapixel sensor to a 12 megapixel sensor, which obviously from our last video enables 4K recording, but also is just a much higher quality camera overall. And let's start with that. I didn't do a lot of comparisons between the XS and the 11 on the selfie camera because honestly, I don't care that much about the selfie camera myself. And I may have made a mistake in doing that because I was expecting terrible quality from the selfie camera because that's what I'm used to. You've got over smoothing or over sharpening. But actually, Apple has made great strides with the selfie camera. What used to be a mediocre camera now takes okay pictures. In low light, it's still not great. It's still a tiny sensor, tiny aperture. I wouldn't really rely on it much. It still takes better low light pictures than the ultra-wide camera, which is interesting. The ultra-wide, by comparison to the tiny selfie camera, it actually is terrible in low light. That 2.4 aperture isn't letting in a lot of light. But overall, the selfie camera, it's decent. As far as selfie cameras go, it might not be the best in the world, but I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. It's not that important to me, personally. Moving on to color quality. This wasn't really a big problem with the iPhone XS. Its photos tend to come out just a little bit warm, a little bit magenta/red, whereas we're looking at the iPhone 11, we see a slightly more neutral rendition. By comparison, it looks a little bit greenish, but it's actually just a little bit more accurate. Now we're going to be looking at sample images side by side. Just remember, all the time, on the left we have the iPhone 11, on the right we have the iPhone XS. And so as you can see, the colors are still very similar. And if we look at some landscape slash skies, still not a huge difference. The biggest differences are mostly actually in the light and the shadows, the dynamic range of the photos themselves. We have moved towards slightly more accurate images. Overall, it was already pretty great. And so color quality, it's a 9 out of 10. It's not perfect, and it's not vastly superior to everything else, just a little bit. It's solid though. Next up, portrait mode. Well, we're not comparing the portrait mode of this to, say, a full-frame sensored camera with a beautiful portrait lens. No, we're just talking about this versus other portrait mode systems. So, what's the difference here? Honestly, they talked a big game about more natural transitions and so forth, and while it is certainly a little more natural in the way that it falls off, as you can see in her shirt here, it actually takes into account a greater amount of the plane of focus. Instead of just taking the face and kind of moving from there, it actually does take into account more of the images. So what is in focus, her shirt and the strap and so forth, very sharp. But as it falls off, it does so in a little bit of a clunky manner, and we're still seeing some strange artifacts around the edges. Again, it's a little bit better than the XS. Not a massive improvement there though. You can use third-party apps to edit this and to make it better manually. So here is a picture that I took at a wedding. Looks fine, everyone's happy. But if you look closer, her earring is gone, even though it kind of shouldn't be. And the fall off is rather abrupt in places. And yeah, we still didn't get that little hole in the elbow there. If we move on to the app called Focus, F-O-C-O-S, we can not only do lens emulation, so that gives us more interesting bokeh. Fall off at the top still isn't great. I was also able to bring that earring back and make sure that the spot inside her elbow was caught there. But still, we have fringing around the edges. I find the sample images that Apple and Google, anyone shows at these events, I don't know how many pictures they had to take before they got those very perfectly stitched images that supposedly came just by tapping that shutter button once, but overall, in almost any circumstance, you don't want to pixel peep the pictures coming off of these smartphones. Sure, they look great even on an iPad, just staring at it like this, but as soon as you start zooming in, you're going to start seeing some strange artifacts in how it performs its computational photography and putting the images together. So the portrait mode, though not perfect, and not even close to what you would get from a real camera if you're looking closely, it's still among the best, if not the best, that you can get right now. It's still limited insofar as it's still looking for an object a certain distance from your smartphone, and if it's not within that certain distance range that it's looking for, you can't do it. Still very limited, but again, you're not getting much better than this in any other smartphone. I have to give it a 9 out of 10. Now if you want me to do, say, a comparison between this and a real camera, to show where the strengths and weaknesses are, let me know down in the comments. Maybe we'll do that if anybody actually watches this video, unlike the last one. Next up, we want to talk about dynamic range. And this is something that I find very interesting. If I were to take a picture with even a professional camera, it is hard to recover the highlights and bring up the shadows. If I'm just taking one shot, sure, I can do it. My A7 III, this camera right here, it's 15 stops of dynamic range. That's phenomenal. I can recover just about anything. But it takes work to do it. Either I have to take multiple pictures and merge them in an HDR, or do some work on the highlights and shadows. Whereas, if I take a picture like this, and this is with a super wide, the least of the cameras, I can see the undersides of these leaves brilliantly, the greens and the blues contrasted together. With my camera, I would have to work hard to bring up all the colors in this image. Now, if I look real close here though, the clouds, the compression artifacts are just intense. And around the leaves, the stitching where it tried to pull back the dynamic range, it's not great. But if I just look at this picture, even on the iPad, at this zoom level, it looks brilliant. It has covered that dynamic range in a natural and beautiful way. Again, it doesn't hold up to great scrutiny, but it does the job fantastically. And if we look at other examples of this, again, It's just a little bit better than the XS. The XS was already great at dynamic range. As an important note, this video and these sample images were taken before the advent of Deep Fusion. That hasn't been released yet. It's just available now in beta, but I don't want to test beta software. It's not honest, it's not what it will necessarily be. We'll look at that later again if this video gets enough likes, gets enough views. We'll have a look at Deep Fusion. These cameras are taking multiple pictures, stitching them together, identifying objects so that it can have an enormous dynamic range, even with a teeny tiny sensor. I appreciate that. I don't have to do a lot of work to make these pictures look good. So here we have a huge dynamic range. My son playing in this fountain. The sun's right on his face. But if we look down here, we can see the shadow, his fingers that are in shadow, we can see his fingers that are in light. That is a tremendous amount of dynamic range. I don't even see any HDR artifacts in this, even though he was in motion. Previous phones, older systems, you would get some artifacts with a moving subject. And again, this scene at the wedding, we have people in shadow, we have a blue sky. Even on my A9, A7 III camera, I would have to do a lot of work to get this kind of dynamic range into a picture, and we can see everything. We've got a bit of a lens flare there that looks kind of weird, and we'll talk about that pretty soon. This flare down the side is curved in a way that you wouldn't see really anywhere else. Why is that? Well, let's get dynamic range out of the way first. And I have to say, it's a 9 out of 10. It's fantastic. I haven't seen anything clearly better, but most phones are doing this HDR stacking. I've heard that it might get even better once we have the new update, the new updated firmware that brings in the Deep Fusion AI. Image clarity. This is one spot where we do get a significant bump over the XS. So on the face of things, the XS appears to be about the same clarity as the iPhone 11. I brought them both around on this little doohickey. No stabilizers or anything, just both of them taking the same picture at the same time from the same place. And when we open up a picture, they look very similar. But when we zoom in, if we look at the detail in the iPhone 11 picture, and then move over to the XS picture, things are much, much muddier on the XS picture. We see a much greater level of sharpness, especially when we're looking at skin and skin tones. There's some noise reduction going on right down at the very bottom level of the skin tones on the XS that we don't see on the 11. See, on the XS, she looks great. Nothing wrong with this picture, but then when we get to the 11, there's so much more texture here. And again, Deep Fusion is going to up that ante even further. So where is this coming from? Well, we do have better image processing in the iPhone 11, faster processor, and a dedicated AI architecture that allows it to process this stuff very quickly. At the same time, I'm pretty sure that just the lenses themselves are clearer, higher quality. Most people don't realize that lenses are a huge part of image quality. If you have a fantastic sensor, fantastic image architecture, it's still not going to get you very far if you don't have a sharp enough lens. These lenses that I'm looking at you at, they're pretty sharp. They're very expensive. It's hard to make an enormously sharp lens that is this tiny, and they've done a great job. These lenses are very sharp. They have a lot of detail and a lot of clarity. Again, let's look real close at my friend Elizabeth here. You have highlights, you have shadows retained, and then once we look at the XS, there looks to be a lot of artifacting. There was some in the iPhone 11, but not nearly as much. So, I was saying before, don't pixel peep on these. On the iPhone 11, you can a little. So if you're going to be printing things, if you're going to be blowing up these pictures just a little bit, the iPhone 11 is clearly better. If you're just looking at them on the screen of your phone and sharing them on screens, looking at them in their normal fit-to-screen aspects, there's not a huge difference, honestly. People are saying that there's this giant jump in camera. In all these image samples, I haven't seen a lot. Now, I do want to tell you about one tricky thing that Apple is doing in the iPhone 11 to make people think that its pictures contain way more detail than the iPhone XS. When you take a picture on the XS and you zoom in on it on the screen, let's say we have this picture. This was taken with the night mode, which we'll talk about very soon, on the 11. If you zoom in on this picture as far as you can on the XS, this is how far you get. That's not very far. I noticed this very quickly when I was pixel peeping on my images while I was working on them out on the street. So you can't get in very far on the XS. Same software revision. Whereas on the 11, you can zoom in pretty much as far as you want. That's an interesting choice. They're running the same software, same number of megapixels. You can zoom in and zoom in and zoom in on the 11 until you see the pixels themselves. But on the XS, nope. No zooming past this point, and that is not very zoomed in. So that is an interesting choice on their part. If you ask me, I feel like they're going a little fast and loose with that, and trying to trick people just a little bit into thinking that the iPhone 11 is even more detailed, even more sharp than it is. Or maybe they're just trying to keep you from seeing how soft or compressed the iPhone XS pictures are. I don't know the reasons behind it, but be aware of that. There is some trickery going on there. So overall, image clarity, I have never seen a smartphone take pictures this clear, this sharp before. It's a 10 out of 10. Except in the wide-angle lens. The wide-angle camera is not the same level of quality as the rest of the cameras on this. When you zoom in on the wide-angle, it's a bit of a mess. I love the wide-angle lens, I love taking pictures with it, but if you want something that is detailed, something that is clear and crisp, I would recommend taking a panorama with the medium lens rather than the wide-angle. Now the wide angles can still take some shots that you just can't get with that panorama. It can get some beautiful angles. I was standing pretty much exactly next to my son in this picture. Same thing for the fountain. But I can take a very good picture of him from that distance, showing all of him. Another issue with this wide-angle camera is when you make a wide-angle lens, it's really hard to get the corners straight, to make everything rectangular as a picture should be instead of spherical, what one might call fisheye when you get very wide. So through software, Apple is doing some hardcore magic here. They're working very hard to keep everything straight. And honestly, they are doing a phenomenal job of this. But if we look at this picture, the flagpole on the right is not bent in real life. In the wide-angle lens, it is kind of messed up. So not only are the edges just a little bit curved, they are unpredictably curved. And when things are near the edge of this camera lens, things can get real messy real fast. So I would try to avoid super straight lines near the edges if you're, bothered by this sort of thing. But for me, this is a fantastic picture though, as long as I don't look too close. It's a great memory. I was walking through downtown with him, pull out the camera, pop, I've got a great picture. No, I'm not going to win any awards with it, but we're making memories here, and the wide-angle lens allows me to take pictures of things that are happening right next to me, but still capture everything that's happening. So, overall, again, image clarity is a 10 out of 10. Just don't expect all of that in a bag of chips from the wide-angle lens, but you're not going to get much better anywhere else anyway. Next up is the biggest difference, the biggest change from the XS to the 11, it's low light. You probably already know that now with the iPhone 11s, we have a night mode. But does it make that much of a difference? Let me show you. Here is a picture taken on the iPhone XS in the dark. No flash. Can you tell what it is? Probably not. And here's a picture taken with the 11 Pro with night mode. Oh my goodness. This was a 5-second exposure. If we zoom in, is it amazing? No, it's not perfect. But to be perfectly honest, I was shocked with the level of detail that I could get. Again, let's go back. XS, iPhone 11. That's ridiculous. But, huge caveat for any night mode. If your subject is moving, you're not going to be able to get much detail out of them. This might seem obvious to you, it won't be obvious to everyone. It's taking a longer exposure, multiple images, stacking them together, squeezing out all the detail it can through computational photography. But because of that, if your subject moves much, they get real blurry. If you're taking a larger picture with multiple objects in it, if things move around, it will sometimes just take one of the frames of that thing. It won't have a lot of detail, but it won't be blurry. If your main subject moves, It's not going to be great. It will cut that exposure. It is very smart about how it does this. It avoids letting things get blurry. It'll cut the exposure, just keep the amount of time that your subject didn't move. So for the most part, it is smart, but there are obviously circumstances where it just doesn't know what's going on and things get real sloppy. Does that make it unusable? No, not at all. These pictures are great. I wouldn't be able to get these pictures otherwise. And honestly, let's face it, we're about to move into a new phase of smartphone photography where people understand the physics behind what's going on. Not necessarily the physics, but the mechanics. We're going to be in a new phase where people are at a restaurant, people are at a bar, and they say, hey, take a picture of me, which that's what we do. Take my picture with this guy, with this drink, with this thing. And people will automatically assume that some night mode is going to be used, and they're going to be holding very still. Already you see people saying, take my picture. They hold very, very still. They hold that winning duck face look that I'm not even going to emulate. And they know they have to hold it for 5-6 seconds if they want a really good picture. And they do. What's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. If you want a solid picture, even with a full frame camera, you take a longer exposure in the dark. That's just the way it works. And honestly, I find it interesting and even pleasing that people are now understanding that that's how you have to take a good low light picture. Even if I'm using a many $1,000 full frame camera, I'm gonna pull out that shutter speed as long as I can and take that picture. So it's funny that now that computational photography is taking care of a lot more stuff for us these days, it's actually forcing people to learn things that they didn't really know or think about before. Very interesting. Back to our scoring system, night mode, low light, it's a 10 out of 10. Other cameras, other phones have different ways of doing this, but honestly I prefer the iPhone one. It lets you know when it's happening, it comes on automatically. It lets you bump up the amount of time that you're going to be using for your exposure of night mode, so it might start out with 3, but you can push that up to 6 and get an even better picture. It's up to you, but it's also automatic. It's a great combination. Segueing straight into that is interface. I love the way they executed night mode in their interface. But just like in the last video, when I talked about video, the interface is getting tired. Apple uses this minimalist camera interface that, sure, it's great. It does what it needs to do, and when it first came out, it was imitated, it was duplicated, because it worked really well for what it did, but the iPhone didn't do a lot back then. And now this minimalist interface, it's getting cluttery, it's getting hard to use. It's hard to discover all the things that you need to do, all the things that you can do. It's not as troublesome as when you're in video modes, because in video, it's nice to be able to change your frame rates, to change your resolution. Those are things we don't change a lot in phones, so at least we don't need to go into the settings app a lot when we're doing photos. That's a huge knock against the interface on the video side. So the interface, I gave a 6 on the video side. Now that we're on the photo side, I'm giving it a 7. It's not terrible, but it's really showing its age, and there are some cracks around the seams because there's so much that you can do now, but it's so hard to do a lot of those things. Get to swipe up and down and know the icons and stuff. Again, I really like how they implemented night mode, but everything else is building up to a level of cruft that's kind of annoying. It still looks good, it still functions well, but it needs some work. So, 7 out of 10 for interface. Alright, where does that get us? That's a 62 out of 70. That is solid. That's a higher score than I gave for the video. Well, higher percentage-wise. Anyway, watch that video. A lot of people were saying this was a huge quantum leap over the iPhone XS. From my perspective, that's a misuse of the term quantum leap. That's not what quantum leap means. Go watch some classic sci-fi. Stop using that phrase. It is a small leap over the XS for most photography purposes, except for that night mode. For low light, stationary objects, it is amazingly better than the XS. For everything else, keep your XS. It still takes great pictures. I feel like a lot of people forgot how good that was just because the Pixel 3 started taking marginally better pictures than the XS in some circumstances. Yeah, so it's not the best camera ever, but there's nothing wrong with your XR or XS camera. That is great. It holds up well to the iPhone 11. If you want to see more image samples, there's a link in the description. You can pixel peep to your heart's content. I've got side-by-sides, I've got solos. It's all broken up. You can look whatever you want. Again, I'm not looking to shoot entire weddings with this, assume that this is a professional photography tool. I just want to have the best memories possible as easily and as quickly as possible in my pocket, wherever I go. And overall, I'm super happy with this. It's a perfect, no, there's always room for improvement. What I was hoping was that this giant camera bump that honestly in the leaks looked a lot bigger was going to house some bigger sensors, but still the same sensor size. The easiest way of getting better photo quality is by having a bigger sensor, bigger optics. So what I'd like to see, if you're going to have a bump this big, this obtrusive, just make it a little bit bigger, a little bit thicker. Give me those huge sensors. Give me just mind-blowing photo quality. Anyway, we're getting into the reads here. You don't want to hear about all that. Well, maybe you do. Let me know. I want to know overall what you think. What do you think about the iPhone 11 pictures? Let me know what I should be looking at next. Tell me if I'm right or wrong. No big deal. We'll talk about that down in the comments. Speaking of next, we've got the 7 Artisans 35 1.4 for full frame. Most people don't even realize this exists yet. I mean, it's just coming out. So, I'm going to be having a look at that soon. So, until next time, let's go take some photos.